October 22, 1944, Leyte Gulf, the Philippines. The crates arrived by barge, lashed with rope and manhandled across the black water by men who understood exactly what was inside them. Each wooden shipping case held 10 one-liter glass bottles packed in ice, human blood, type O, drawn from donors in California less than 5 days before. Corpsmen on the beach tore into the first case before it was fully unloaded. The bottles were warm, not room temperature warm, hot. A hospital corpsman standing at the mouth of a shell crater that had been converted into an improvised aid station on Yellow Beach watched a surgeon hold one of the bottles up to a kerosene lantern. The blood inside had turned dark and murky, the telltale sign of hemolysis. The red cells had ruptured from the heat, releasing toxic proteins into the fluid. You couldn't transfuse that into a dying man. You might as well inject him with poison. There were men bleeding out 30 yards behind him. The temperature on Leyte that afternoon was 97 degrees Fahrenheit. The dew point was nearly as high. In that tropical furnace, whole blood, one of the most perishable substances on Earth, lasted perhaps 4 hours unrefrigerated before it began to degrade, and 8 before it became dangerous. The blood in those crates had survived the journey from Australia, had made it across the Pacific and onto the beach, and had then cooked in an unshaded barge while the battle raged on shore. Of approximately 3,000 pints of preserved whole blood dispatched to American forces in the first 30 days of the Leyte campaign, sources indicate that the vast majority arrived in an unusable state. This was not a small problem. By the autumn of 1944, surgeons across the Pacific had arrived at an uncomfortable truth that the Army Medical Department had resisted acknowledging for nearly 3 years. Blood plasma, the yellowish, cell-free liquid that had been the miracle of North Africa and Guadalcanal, was not enough. Plasma could expand blood volume and prevent a wounded man from going into shock. It bought time. But it could not carry oxygen. It could not fuel the body's cells through major surgery or restore a man who had lost half his blood volume to a Japanese machine gun. For that, you needed whole blood. You needed red cells. And in the Pacific, whole blood kept dying before it could save anyone. The men bleeding out on Leyte's beaches had no way of knowing that 6,000 miles away, a Navy captain named Lloyd R. Newhouser had spent the past 4 months trying to solve this exact problem. They had no way of knowing that a solution was already being assembled, box by box, route by route, pint by pint, and that the first airlift of properly refrigerated whole blood from the American mainland was scheduled to depart in less than a month. They could not know any of that. They could only work with what they had. What came next would change the arithmetic of survival in the Pacific forever. If you want to see how this critical innovation rewrote history and saved countless lives, support us with a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Here's how they did it. The journey to that crisis on Leyte had begun long before the first shots were fired in the Pacific. It had begun, in fact, with a fundamental misunderstanding about how human beings die. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, its medical establishment had a sophisticated view of trauma and shock, and that view was wrong in one crucial respect. The prevailing wisdom held that a seriously wounded soldier lost fluid. The treatment, therefore, was fluid replacement. By 1941, American researchers had developed dried plasma that could be reconstituted in the field from a small sealed can and an ampule of distilled water. It required no refrigeration, survived jungle heat and sea voyages, could be given to any blood type without matching, and it worked. At Guadalcanal in 1942, plasma stabilized thousands of men who would otherwise have died on stretchers. The Navy and Army procurement apparatus produced it by the hundreds of thousands of packages and shipped it to every theater of the war. The problem was more subtle than the medicine suggested. Plasma replaced volume, but a man in hemorrhagic shock was not simply missing fluid, he was missing oxygen-carrying capacity. The hemoglobin packed into red blood cells that, molecule by molecule, ferried oxygen from his lungs to his brain, heart, and surgical wounds. Plasma, however expertly administered, could not do that job. A surgeon might stabilize a soldier with plasma, measure a blood pressure that looked acceptable on paper, and send him into an operating theater, only to watch him crash on the table when the anesthesia dropped his pressure and there were simply no red cells left to sustain him. Surgeons in Italy had figured this out by early 1944, watching men die on operating tables after being successfully resuscitated with plasma. Surgeons in the Pacific had understood it even earlier, because the wounds they were treating were frequently catastrophic. Men hit by Japanese 25mm cannon fire, torn apart by mortar fragments in the tight jungle fighting of New Guinea and the Solomons, suffering blood loss that plasma could not compensate. But understanding the problem and solving it were two entirely different challenges, and the challenge in the Pacific was the most severe on Earth. To understand why, you need to understand what whole blood is and what it demands. Whole blood, red cells, white cells, plasma, and platelets together, is fragile in ways that dried plasma is not. It must be stored cold, between 4 and 8 degrees Celsius, a narrow window that kills the bacteria that would otherwise proliferate and also slows the metabolic breakdown of the red cells themselves. Even under ideal refrigeration, blood has a limited shelf life. Using the best preservative available in 1944, a solution called acid citrate dextrose, or ACD, whole blood remained safe for transfusion for approximately 21 days. After that, the red cells had shed enough of their structural integrity that transfusing them could trigger dangerous reactions in the recipient. 21 days sounds generous, but consider the Pacific Theater in 1944. The nearest population center capable of supplying large numbers of blood donors was the continental United States, which lay 5,000 miles from the Western Pacific's front lines. Even by air, and the Pacific was an air transport theater by necessity, the journey from an American city to a forward aid station on a contested island took days. The blood then needed to be inspected, re-iced, and routed forward through a chain of air bases and staging areas before reaching the men who needed it. Every hour that blood sat warm was an hour closer to the end of its usable life. And then there was the heat. The tropics imposed a physics problem that no determination could solve. Ice melts. The Pacific sun, reflecting off black volcanic sand, could push temperatures above 100 degrees on beaches that doubled as casualty collection points. A container of ice and blood that might hold temperature for 48 hours in San Francisco would lose its cold in 6 on Leyte. Europe had faced a version of this problem and solved it more easily. The blood airlift to Britain began in August 1944, in the coolest months of the North Atlantic autumn and winter, when the risk of blood overheating during transit was minimal. Europe also offered something the Pacific did not: short distances from donor populations to front lines, overland routes supplemented by local collection from troops in rear areas, and a climate that, while hardly stable, was at least not tropical. The Army had begun flying blood across the Atlantic without refrigeration at all in late 1944 and had gotten away with it partly because of the season. The Pacific offered none of those accommodations. It offered open ocean, equatorial heat, and an archipelago of contested islands where the fighting moved faster than supply depots could be established. The problem demanded a purpose-built solution, not an adaptation of what was working elsewhere. The Australians had found a partial answer as early as December 1942. Working out of New South Wales, they developed heavily insulated wooden shipping cases, each designed to hold 10 1-liter bottles and 56 pounds of ice, capable of maintaining safe storage temperature during air transport through the Southwest Pacific. By mid-1943, American forces in the region were receiving blood from Australian sources, flown forward by aircraft. It worked within a radius, but Australia was too far from the Western Pacific's advancing front lines, and its population was too small to supply the volumes an American offensive would eventually require. When the island-hopping campaign began moving toward Japan in earnest, toward the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Australian sources would be left behind the action entirely. In June 1944, Captain Lloyd R. Newhouser, MC, USN, the director of the Navy's Blood and Plasma Program, received orders to proceed to the Pacific and assess the situation. He brought with him Colonel Douglas B. Kendrick, his Army counterpart. Their survey, which ran from June 6 to August 8, 1944, covered the New Guinea coast, the Central Pacific bases, and the hospital ships evacuating casualties from the ongoing battles for the Marianas. What they found was systematic. Everywhere they went, surgeons reported the same thing. Men were dying who should have lived. Plasma was not enough. Locally sourced blood was chronically short, contaminated by the rampant malaria that infected a significant fraction of troops in the Southwest Pacific, and unreliable in volume. The front was moving faster than local supply could follow. Their recommendation, filed in August 1944, was stark. The United States needed to airlift whole blood from the mainland on a continuous, industrial basis. Not occasionally, not as an emergency supplement. Daily. Through 1942 and most of 1943, plasma had seemed like the answer because, to a point, it was. At Guadalcanal, from August 1942 through February 1943, American corpsmen administered plasma to thousands of Marines and soldiers across hundreds of engagements. The standard plasma kit weighed under 4 pounds, required no refrigeration, could be set up in a shell crater with minimal training, and began flowing in under 2 minutes. Corpsmen learned to start it under fire, one hand pressing a gauze pad to a wound while the other held the administration tubing. Plasma stabilized men who were in shock, raised their blood pressure off the floor, and bought the hours needed to evacuate them from the front. The numbers at Guadalcanal were genuinely impressive. The killed-to-wounded ratio for American forces on the island ran at roughly 1 death for every 3 wounded men who reached any form of medical care. For armies in previous wars, in World War I, for instance, where infection and uncontrolled hemorrhage killed enormous fractions of the already wounded, that ratio would have been unthinkable. Plasma was a major reason why. At Tarawa in November 1943, where the first 24 hours of fighting produced more American casualties per hour than almost any Pacific engagement before or since, plasma again performed as advertised at the aid station level. At Cape Gloucester in December 1943, at Kwajalein in February 1944, at Bougainville, across the Solomons and into New Guinea, wherever corpsmen could reach a fallen man and start an IV, plasma bought time. But the surgeons operating behind the lines saw something the casualty figures didn't capture. They saw the men who died on their tables. They saw the pattern. A Marine would arrive at a field hospital, blood pressure 80/50, pulse thready but present, responsive to plasma, apparently stabilized. Then the anesthesiologist would begin preparation for an abdominal wound repair or a limb amputation, and the pressure would drop, and they would add more plasma, and the pressure would come up slightly, and it would drop again, and eventually they would lose the man. His blood type had been checked against the unit's small emergency supply, always inadequate, and it hadn't matched, or the supply had run out 2 casualties ago. A man stabilized on plasma was not a man being saved, he was a man being held. The oxygen-carrying deficit that plasma could not address meant that for the abdominal wounds, the chest wounds, the men who'd lost more than 1.5 liters of blood, the hold was temporary. Without whole blood, the surgery itself could kill them. The Saipan campaign in June and July 1944 crystallized the situation. American forces suffered approximately 3,000 killed and 13,000 wounded in the fighting on that island. Of the wounded, 5,000 eventually returned to duty, a genuine measure of medical success and one that reflected the increasing skill of Navy corpsmen and forward surgical teams. But the surgeons who had worked those operating tables knew how many of those 13,000 had survived because local blood donations from support troops and airfield personnel had been available at precisely the right moment, a fortuitous circumstance that could not be planned and could not be relied upon. The improvised collection systems that had worked barely at Guadalcanal and then at Saipan depended on healthy men in rear areas willing to donate on short notice. It was a system that worked when a campaign had time to develop, when there were enough troops in relatively stable positions to serve as a donor pool. It could not work at the edge of an opposed amphibious landing, where there were no rear areas, no established positions, and every man on the beach was potentially the next casualty rather than the next donor. What would happen when the next campaign landed on a beach with no margin at all? The answer was going to be Leyte. November 16, 1944. Army Air Forces Airfield, Oakland, California. The plane that left for Guam that morning carried, along with its regular cargo of military supplies, 10 wooden insulated shipping cases. Each case was roughly the size of a large suitcase, built from fiberboard and wood, lined with insulating material, packed with 56 pounds of shaved ice, and holding 10 sealed 1-liter glass bottles. Inside each bottle was approximately 500 cubic centimeters of type O whole blood, drawn from a donor in Los Angeles, Oakland, or San Francisco within the past 48 hours, preserved in 120 cubic centimeters of ACD solution, tested for blood group, syphilis, and abnormalities, and vacuum-sealed. The 10 cases together held 160 pints of blood. It was not very much, but it was the beginning of something that had never existed before, a transcontinental blood supply chain built to deliver the most fragile of human substances across the largest ocean on Earth. Lieutenant Henry S. Blake, M.C., USN, was the officer in charge of that first shipment. He had overseen the loading himself, verifying that the ice was fresh and the bottles intact, understanding as well as anyone in the Navy that the margin for error in whole blood transport was essentially zero. The blood would arrive at Pearl Harbor approximately 12 hours later, where it would be inspected and re-iced before continuing west. Another leg to Guam, the distribution hub that Captain Neuhauser had designated as the Pacific Blood Bank's forward warehouse. From Guam, individual shipments would be routed to Leyte, to Biak, to wherever the fighting was hottest. The total flight time from Oakland to the Western Pacific was approximately 48 hours. But the pipeline was not just about flight time. It was about the entire cold chain, the unbroken sequence of refrigeration, inspection, and re-icing that kept the blood alive at every stage of its journey. This was why the insulated shipping case was so critical, and why Captain Neuhauser and his team had spent the preceding months developing and testing it, while the Army's European blood program was still flying blood across the Atlantic without refrigeration. The Navy's expendable wooden box, built to be used once and discarded, was not a glamorous piece of technology. There were no electronics, no mechanical cooling system, just insulation, ice, and physics. But it solved the specific physics problem of the Pacific. Blood could endure the climate if the ice held, and the ice could hold if the container was properly designed. The pilot run in September 1944 had confirmed that the design worked. Trial shipments of blood in the Navy's insulated cases had maintained safe temperature through mock transits. The only complaint about the original boxes was their color, a glossy light tan that reflected in the Pacific moonlight and attracted Japanese aircraft on strafing runs. Subsequent containers were painted olive drab. The first operational shipment departed in November. By the end of that month, daily blood deliveries were reaching Leyte and other Pacific theaters. The contrast with what had happened there just weeks before, when the blood arrived cooked, was not lost on anyone. The Leyte disaster had, in retrospect, been the critical education. It had taught Captain Neuhauser and Colonel Kendrick exactly how not to deliver blood to a tropical theater. The local blood collected in Australia had made it most of the way through the logistics chain, but the ground transport on Leyte, the barge crossing, the unshaded beach, had destroyed weeks of careful preservation in a matter of hours. No amount of cold storage at the source could survive that final gap. The solution Neuhauser implemented was ruthlessly simple: control every link. Blood collected at Red Cross centers in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Oakland was transported by air, not surface, to the processing laboratory the Navy established in Oakland, California. There it was typed, tested, rebottled in vacuum glass containers with ACD solution, placed in the insulated cases with fresh ice, and loaded onto the next available long-range aircraft. At Pearl Harbor, the ice was refreshed and each bottle inspected. At Guam, the distribution hub inspected and re-iced again and routed the shipments forward. At the forward bases, dedicated blood bank facilities, self-contained, refrigerated, staffed by trained Navy personnel, received the shipments and distributed them to field hospitals and aid stations. The Advanced Blood Bank Facility at Guam, managed by Lieutenant Herbert R. Brown, Jr., MC USNR, became the nerve center of the Western Pacific operation. Brown's March 1945 assessment noted that since the airlift began, it had not been necessary to make a single major change to the original program. The system worked because it had been designed to solve every specific failure the Leyte crisis had revealed. By January 1945, Red Cross collection centers in Portland and San Diego had been added to the supply chain. Chicago came online the same month. After Germany's defeat in May 1945, whole blood for the Pacific began flowing from New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, and Brooklyn. The pipeline that had begun with 10 boxes on a single plane was becoming something that would have seemed fantastic 18 months earlier, an industrial supply chain for human blood, stretching from American living rooms to the shores of contested islands in the Western Pacific. The men who would need it most were already in training for Iwo Jima. Captain Neuhauser's blood pipeline was not simply a logistical achievement, it was a philosophical statement, made in the language of supply chains and refrigerated containers, about what a wounded soldier's life was worth. That philosophy had roots stretching back to December 1941, when Dr. Isidor S. Ravdin, a colonel serving with the Army Medical Corps and one of the leading surgeons of his generation, arrived in Honolulu in the days following the Pearl Harbor attack with a supply of experimental albumin and began treating the most severely burned and shocked survivors. Albumin, a protein fraction separated from blood plasma, was effective at stabilizing men who had been critically burned. Ravdin injected it into 7 of the worst cases on his first day in Hawaii. All 7 improved. Dozens more followed. The results informed the Army and Navy's immediate push to industrialize both albumin and plasma production, confirming a principle that would guide American military medicine through the entire war. The investment required to save one soldier's life was worth making. This was not a universal assumption. It was, in fact, a choice. The Japanese Imperial Army operated under a fundamentally different framework, one rooted in the Bushido Code and its practical military expression. Japanese soldiers were trained, indoctrinated really, to regard survival as secondary to duty and death in battle as an honorable outcome. This translated into military doctrine in ways that had concrete medical consequences. Japan developed no equivalent to the American whole-blood airlift, no systematic effort to push surgical care forward to the company level, no infrastructure for evacuating wounded from contested beaches under fire. Japanese military medical resources were limited and concentrated in rear areas. A Japanese soldier severely wounded in a forward position had little realistic expectation of reaching a surgeon in time for his wound to be treated effectively. The result appears in the casualty statistics in ways that are nearly impossible to dismiss. The Pacific War Online Encyclopedia, drawing on official Japanese Army records, found that the Japanese Army experienced a 95% death rate among its combat casualties, a figure that reflects not just wounds themselves, but the complete absence of the infrastructure that might have saved those men. Among American forces in the Pacific, by contrast, the Army Surgeon General reported to the American Medical Association in June 1943 that an estimated 96 out of every 100 wounded men survived, a figure that represented the combined effect of plasma, forward surgical capability, and air evacuation. Those numbers describe two different decisions made before the first shot was fired. One army built the machinery to save its soldiers, the other did not. But acknowledging the Japanese military's failure to build such a system does not explain why the American system was so difficult to build, or why it took until late 1944 to make it work. The answer lies in four engineering problems that had to be solved simultaneously. First, collection. You needed enough blood donors to supply an industrial-scale operation. The American Red Cross's National Blood Donation Network, which had collected over 5 million units in 1944 alone, solved this. It had been built piece by piece since 1941, with collection centers in every major American city, mobile blood-mobile units reaching communities without fixed centers, and a public outreach program that had made blood donation a civic act as familiar as war bond drives. Second, preservation. You needed a solution that would keep blood alive long enough to travel. ACD solution, developed by British researchers J.F. Laudit and Patrick Mollison and adopted by the Navy for the Pacific airlift from the beginning, expended shelf life to 21 days at proper refrigeration, nearly half again longer than earlier preservative solutions. This single choice made the transcontinental airlift mathematically feasible. Third, transport. You needed aircraft capable of flying blood 5,000 miles without breaking the cold chain. The Navy's answer was the expendable insulated box. No electronics, no machinery, just physics and ice, combined with the logistics of Pearl Harbor and Guam as re-icing stations. It worked because it was simple enough to work at scale. Fourth, forward delivery. You needed the blood to reach the men who needed it, not just the base hospitals. This meant training corpsmen in transfusion technique, equipping aid stations with small refrigerators and transfusion kits, and building the advanced blood bank facilities that could distribute stock to forward areas within hours of an airlift arrival. The thesis of the Pacific Blood Program, stated simply, a wounded man's survival is not an acceptable loss. Every logistical decision, every technical choice, every dollar spent on Red Cross collection drives and insulated shipping cases was an implementation of that principle. February 19, 1945, 0900 hours, Iwo Jima. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions began landing on the southeastern shores of Iwo Jima under one of the most intense defensive fires any American force had yet encountered in the Pacific. The volcanic black sand of the beach, fine and loose, impossible to dig into, impossible to walk across quickly, trapped men in the open while concealed Japanese positions in the cliffs and the volcanic ridgeline of Mount Suribachi delivered fire from 3 sides. Within the first hour, casualties were running at roughly 5% of the attacking force. Medical planning for the Iwo Jima campaign had begun 4 months earlier, in October 1944. Navy medical officers had known from the terrain analysis that there would be no possibility of tactical surprise. The Marines would land on those specific beaches, would face a frontal assault up volcanic rock and loose sand, and would take catastrophic casualties on the first 2 days. Anticipated first-day losses had been calculated and built into the logistical plan. And for the first time in a Pacific amphibious operation, that logistical plan specifically included a continuous, pre-positioned supply of whole blood. The blood bank facility supporting Iwo Jima was stocked before the landing craft hit the beach. Shipments from Guam, blood that had originated in Oakland, been processed, tested, iced, flown 12 hours to Pearl Harbor for re-icing, flown again to Guam and re-iced once more, were on hand and in refrigeration before H-hour. The advanced blood bank operated from converted vehicles and field facilities that had been established on the island within days of the initial assault, set up under fire by Navy medical personnel who understood that blood left in its cases was no different from blood that had spoiled. The scale of need was staggering. Through D+33, the 33rd day after the initial landing, a total of 17,677 casualties had been treated and evacuated from Iwo Jima. Corpsmen who had trained for this campaign worked in shell craters and foxholes in the volcanic sand, starting plasma while bullets sang overhead and shattered glass blood bottles, then administering whole blood as soon as patients reached the aid stations. Of the 27 Medals of Honor awarded for actions at Iwo Jima, 5 went to Navy corpsmen, men who had moved through open ground under fire to reach the wounded, often discarding their Red Cross armbands because Japanese troops had made medical personnel a deliberate target. The blood supply, for all the planning behind it, was genuinely stretched at moments. There were shortages on the ships offshore where the Navy's hospital vessels were receiving casualties faster than planned. But the key difference from every previous Pacific operation was that the pipeline existed and was feeding. Blood that had been donated in Los Angeles 5 days earlier was on the beaches of Iwo Jima, keeping men alive who would otherwise have died before a surgeon could reach them. What the Army field surgeon's observation about abdominal wounds had documented held true in full. The mortality rate from the wounds that previously had the highest death rate, the torso wounds, the arterial hemorrhages, the cases that plasma alone could not rescue, dropped measurably when whole blood became available at the point of care. Then came Okinawa. April 1, 1945. The American assault on Okinawa, Operation Iceberg, began with the largest amphibious landing in the Pacific War. The 82-day battle that followed would prove to be the most costly campaign in the Pacific theater, producing more American casualties than Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima combined. The ferocity of the Japanese defense, anchored by nearly 100,000 Imperial Army troops in deeply constructed defensive positions, produced a sustained rate of American wounded that dwarfed any previous operation. The blood pipeline absorbed it. For the 46,000 American soldiers and Marines wounded on Okinawa, the blood bank network delivered 46,000 pints of whole blood, a ratio of 1 unit per wounded man, precisely the figure that British blood transfusion pioneer Brigadier Lionel Whitby had estimated as the operational target back in 1940. That ratio had seemed theoretical when Whitby first proposed it. At Okinawa in 1945, it was achieved across 82 days of continuous fighting, sustained by a logistical chain that reached back to blood donors on the American mainland. At its peak in May 1945, the Pacific Airlift was delivering up to 12,000 pints of blood in a single week. The Red Cross collection centers, now drawing on donors in Chicago, New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, in addition to the original West Coast network, were sustaining the supply despite the fact that 5 million Americans had already donated in 1944 alone. For the Japanese soldiers defending Okinawa, the medical picture was a photographic negative of the American one. Japanese forces lost approximately 100,000 men on that island. Their military medicine had no equivalent infrastructure, no supply chain of refrigerated blood running back to the Japanese home islands, no advanced blood banks on the ridgelines. The 95% combat casualty death rate that characterized the Japanese army across the Pacific theater operated in full on Okinawa. A Japanese soldier wounded in one of the fortified cave complexes deep in the Shuri line had access to the medical supplies his unit carried. When those ran out, there was no pipeline feeding forward. The contrast was not invisible to the men fighting on both sides of the battle line. American soldiers and Marines who had fought at Guadalcanal in 1942, where the plasma supply was adequate but whole blood was improvised at best, and who now found themselves on Okinawa in 1945 with refrigerated blood arriving daily from Guam, experienced a tangible shift in what they believed was possible if they were hit. Getting wounded had always been terrifying. Now, for an American Marine on Okinawa, it was slightly less so. The corpsmen who administered that blood at Okinawa worked under conditions that defy easy description. On June 8, 1945, hospital apprentice First Class Fred F. Lester, attached to the 1st Battalion 22nd Marines, spotted a wounded Marine lying in open ground beyond the front lines after an assault on a Japanese-held hill. He crawled toward the men under concentrated machine gun, rifle, and grenade fire. Shot once, he kept moving. Shot a second time before reaching cover, he pulled the Marine to safety. Then, realizing his own wounds were fatal, refused medical attention for himself and calmly instructed his squad in treating the other wounded men around him. He died shortly after. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He was 19 years old. When the battle for Okinawa ended in June 1945, American planners immediately turned their attention to Operation Olympic, the projected invasion of Japan's home islands scheduled for November 1945. Their estimates, drawn from the casualty rates at Okinawa and Iwo Jima extrapolated across a much larger assault force, called for approximately 267,000 American wounded in the first phase alone. The Blood Pipeline's planners began calculating what it would take to supply that operation. Their answer: 300,000 pints of whole blood pre-positioned before the first landing craft hit the beach. The bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended that calculation before it was ever tested. The 100,000 pints of blood and plasma already pre-positioned for Olympic were instead used to treat the survivors of the atomic attacks. The Red Pipeline, by the numbers. The supply chain. Blood airlift from U.S. mainland to Pacific. 88,728 units shipped between December 1944 and September 1945. Peak single-week delivery, 12,000 pints, May 1945. American Red Cross total blood donations across the war, 13,326,242 units collected between February 1941 and September 1945. Red Cross donations in 1944 alone, 5,371,664 units, the single largest annual collection in history to that point. The cold chain. Blood preserved in ACD solution, shelf life of 21 days under refrigeration, 4 to 8 degrees Celsius. Navy expendable insulated shipping case, held 10 1-liter bottles plus 56 pounds of ice, maintained safe temperature through transoceanic flight. Re-icing stations, Pearl Harbor, a 12-hour flight from Oakland, and Guam, both required for every Pacific airlift. The medical impact. American wounded survival rate. 96 out of 100 wounded men survived. Army Surgeon General, 1943. Abdominal wound mortality. Dropped approximately 20% when whole blood, penicillin, and oxygen therapy became simultaneously available in forward areas. Okinawa. 46,000 pints delivered for 46,000 wounded, 1 unit per casualty, the operational target achieved. The contrast. Japanese Army combat casualty death rate, approximately 95%. American combat casualty death rate among those who reached medical care, approximately 4%. Japanese Army on Okinawa estimated 110,000 killed. No whole blood supply pipeline. The last blood shipment of the Pacific War left Oakland in August 1945 after Japan's surrender. The whole blood program was discontinued almost immediately. The Red Cross collection centers closed one by one, the Navy processing laboratory in Oakland stood down, and the insulated shipping cases that had crossed the Pacific thousands of times were discarded as the expendable items they had been designed to be. The pipeline vanished as quickly as it had been built. But it left something behind. The principles Neuhauser and Kendrick had worked out under pressure in 1944, typed and tested blood, ACD preservation, unbroken refrigeration from donor to patient, standardized administration kits at the company level, did not vanish with the shipping cases. They became the architecture of the modern blood banking system. When the American Red Cross reformed its post-war blood services, the infrastructure was built on wartime protocols. When the Korean War began in June 1950, the whole blood airlift from Oakland resumed within weeks because the institutional knowledge had never fully dispersed. The deeper legacy is harder to see in any single document or decision, but it is visible in the numbers. Today, every major military with access to modern medical care maintains some form of blood supply chain forward of the front lines. The principle that a wounded soldier's survival is worth the logistical logistical investment required to sustain it, a principle that was not obvious in 1943, that had to be fought for against competing priorities and institutional skepticism, is now simply assumed. The Japanese Army's 95% combat casualty death rate is not remembered as the product of courage or Bushido discipline. It is remembered as what happens when an institution decides, or fails to decide, that the machinery of survival is worth building. The men who donated blood at Red Cross centers in Chicago and Los Angeles in the spring of 1945 did not know which Marine on Okinawa would receive their blood. The Marines who received it did not know the donors' names. The pipeline that connected them was anonymous, industrial, and by any measure, one of the most consequential logistical achievements of the Second World War. 160 pints. 10 insulated boxes, a single plane departing San Francisco on November 16, 1944. By September 1945, the blood of nearly 90,000 transfusions had flowed through that pipeline, across 5,000 miles of open ocean, into the veins of men who needed it. The red pipeline ran silent and largely unrecognized while battles of ships and bombs consumed the historical record. But for the corpsman kneeling in the volcanic sand with a transfusion needle in his hand, it was the most important supply line in the Pacific. It still is.